The second piece that we know from retrieving, though, is that retrieving from long-term memory is often relying on cues or associations. So I'm sure you're all familiar with like how to just struggle to retrieve things. Perhaps you experience this while taking the exam for this class, where you're like, I know that information, I just can't get it, right? If long-term memory is truly unlimited, why is it so challenging to retrieve information at certain times? Well, one of the reasons is that it might largely depend on how good we are at organizing the information in our storage. So consider these two storage units. Let's say you needed to find your old box of comic books. Now pretend both of these storage units have the same exact items, but this one on the right is probably a lot easier to search through, right? So when you struggle to remember something you've learned, it's usually not an issue of it not being stored in long-term memory, but rather being able to easily retrieve it and find where it is. So you can think of your brain kind of like a storage unit. The more organized it is, the easier it is to then find what you need. Now, there are several things that we can do to better organize our long-term memory and help us retrieve that information more efficiently. And one of those things are using cues. So a cue is anything that helps you access target information. So you can think of cues kind of like labels in a filing cabinet, baby pics, like those kind of short words that help you know what's in that folder. Or, in the technology days, things like the name that you give to your files, your different folders, that helps you then remember what's in that folder. Or if you remember this grocery list example when we talked about chunking, things like sandwich makings or fruit act as cues for you then to retrieve the actual items that you need later. Now, we see cues a lot in test design. So think about it. Do you find multiple choice exams or written exams easier? Multiple choice exams are what we call recognition tasks. You just have to recognize the right answer. Because there are choices there, you have cues present to help you out. The answer is there. You just have to pick it out. Whereas in a recall task, a short answer kind of essay question, you don't have any cues. The answer is not there. You need to generate it yourself. So typically, the presence of cues makes it easier to do a recognition task, a multiple choice exam, than it is a written task. And we can kind of thank cues for that. But not all cues are created equally. So even if the correct answer is present on a multiple choice test, sometimes that cue isn't sufficient enough for you to recall the correct response. You may have faced this on the exam. Even if you studied that material, sometimes it was still hard to choose the best answer. So this graph is from an experiment where participants were asked to remember a set of 600 words, and they were divided into two different groups. So the first group was allowed to make up their own cues for how to remember those words. The second group was given cues to use. Now, if you look at how well they did on the exam, on the recognition or the recall task, the group that created their own words scored almost 100% on this test, compared to the group that was given cues, scored about half of them right. So TLDR, make your own retrieval cues when you study. So sometimes I might give you tips and examples to use, but it's always more effective to come up with your own cues because they're personal and easier to work with. So the best cues are the ones you generate yourselves. Now, cues don't just have to be words or phrases, though. They can be any sense. They can be smells, sounds, lights. This is due to a concept called encoding specificity, which is the fact that memories tend to incorporate all sorts of unique combinations of information when you encode them. So for instance, if you colored with crayons growing up, you might be able to drop the smell of crayons with a picture like this. Have you ever smelled the scent of crayons and been like, oh man, this takes me back, right? This takes me back to my kindergarten class when I was coloring at my table, that kind of thing. Or maybe you had a parent who had a specific perfume or cologne that they regularly wore, and now when you smell it, you instantly think of them, right? That's because your memories aren't just encoding visual or auditory information. That memory of coloring is also incorporating the sight of your picture, the smell of the crayons, the lighting in the room, all of it. So being cued with one of those things, like the smell of crayons, for instance, can then trigger the whole memory. Now, the cool thing is we can use this to our advantage. So there's a phenomenon called context-dependent memory, which shows that recall for information is best when your study environment, the things around you, also match the testing situation, the things around you when you're testing. So because one of the bits of information that you're encoding when you make a memory is the environment, keeping the environment the same can then trigger those memories of information. So for instance, since we're online this semester, if you plan to take your exams sitting at a desk in your room, you'll do a lot better if you then study at that desk in your room too. So to show you an example, here's a research study where they had participants, scuba divers in particular, learn a set of words either while on land or while underwater. Then they had the scuba divers test either on land or underwater. And they found that the scuba divers that were learned that they studied the words on land and were also tested on land did a lot better. And the scuba divers that learned underwater and were tested underwater did a lot better. It's an interaction. So what this shows is that if you study and you test in the same spot, you'll do better than if you change one of your environments. Now this works for your general state too, not just your environment. So state-dependent memory tells you that your recall is best when your internal state, your mood or mental state, is more similar between those studying and testing conditions. So this is a study that blows my mind. So this is someone who studied while either sober or drunk, and then they took their test, either sober or drunk. This data was actually published in the journal Science in 1969. So this is something that's worth considering. Individuals, again, who were sober when they studied and sober when they were tested did better, as did people who were drunk when they studied, but also drunk when they tested. Coffee works like this too. You don't need to study drunk. Just match your state when you're studying with the state when you're testing. So, memory trick. But even if you study in the same context or in the same environment, retrieval can still be hard. Retrieval from long-term memory isn't an all or nothing phenomenon. Maybe you've been in a situation like this where you're trying to remember the name of something and you're like, okay, it starts with a G, like it's on the tip of my tongue. There's a phenomenon of that exact name, the tip of the tongue phenomenon, which is not being able to fully retrieve a word or a memory, but having partial recall for it. Now, you might ask why this happens. And it's due to the fact that you tend to gradually retrieve things. Tip of the tongue will happen when you're only really remembering peripheral items or cues of the memory you're trying to retrieve, things like the first letter. This might seem pretty inconvenient. You're like, why can't I just remember the whole word? But it's actually making our brain more efficient. So when we use gradual retrieval, when we start with the most basic or salient parts of a memory in order to retrieve the whole memory, we don't have to recall every aspect of the memory right away. So this allows us to store much more in long-term memory, but then with the trade-off of sometimes having to work bottom up in order to try to recall something that's either a huge memory or distant memory or something. So typically when you experience this tip of the tongue phenomenon, you're trying to recall some experience. And we often will then call on others to help us, right? So a good example of this, let's say you're meeting up with old friends and you're reminiscing about your high school adventures. So you may begin with like, remember when, and then you start to build the story together. You start to recreate some event that happened as each friend is adding more detail. And then that then retrieves associations you had forgotten about, and you start to remember more. So this is a great demonstration of how using cues to retrieve specifically encoded bits of information that you might otherwise have trouble, bringing up on your own, but with other people around to help you, you can remember more than you were expecting. But there is a potential problem related to this process. So let's do another demo to show you how reliant we are on cues. I'm going to show you another list of words. I want you to remember these words. And again, you'll have until the end of the video to study them.